Hello, so following on from your lesson yesterday where you used the language of the poem Mametz Wood to create your own poetry, we are going to explore the poem itself today. So we're going to retrieve the technique of personification. So think about why an author might choose to use personification. Think back as well to the use of personification in The Soldier and the effect of that. Impetuous. So see if you can remember when we studied Romeo and Juliet, we looked at impetuous. Now, if someone is impetuous, then they don't think their actions through. They behave in a way which is often very spontaneous. So think about what other characters might behave in an impetuous way in Romeo and Juliet, other than Romeo and Juliet themselves, who you could argue behave incredibly impetuously through, you know, getting married after knowing each other for less than 24 hours, for example. And our new word today is somber. So somber is something that's having or conveying a feeling of deep seriousness and sadness. So something with a somber atmosphere would be very serious and very sad. So you can pause the video and answer those questions. So a writer might use personification to give a particular image or emotion to a thing or an object. So think, for example, for the use of personification in Soldier, he uses personification of England as a woman, and the effect of that personification is real emotional manipulation of those men. You know, you should defend your country as you would defend your own mother. So personification can often give us a very specific image or an emotion. So which characters behave impetuously? Well, most definitely Mercutio. He is a very impetuous character, particularly with the fight with Tybalt. The fact that he starts that fight with him, and you could argue is therefore responsible for all of the tragic things that happen in Act 3, Scene 1, such as the death of himself, the death of Tybalt, Romeo's banishment. You could say that Benvolio was rather impetuous in suggesting that Romeo and him and Mercutio sneak into the Capulet party. That maybe wasn't very well considered. And then, of course, you've got Friar Lawrence. Was he quite impetuous, actually choosing to allow them to get married in the first place, in giving Juliet the potion to fake her own death? So you could argue that there's a lot of characters behaving rather impetuously in Romeo and Juliet. So why might a poet want to create a somber mood to a poem then? Well, if that poem's theme is war, and if that is trying to convey the tragedy of something that happened, then creating a somber mood and atmosphere would be very appropriate, as would a poem of reflection, which is what Mametz Wood is, in fact. So today we're going to analyse and evaluate how war is presented in Mametz Wood. So you are going to learn about the context of the poem, and you are going to learn about how Sheers uses language to explore the theme of war. So first of all, to do that, we are going to watch, hopefully, a short clip.
Well, in the town of Tierpval, many of the names on the British memorial belong to the 38th Welsh Division, a volunteer force which suffered some of the heaviest losses in those first few days, with some 4,000 men killed or injured. Hugh Edwards reports.
A red dragon in the heart of Picardy, standing guard over Mametz Wood. Today, it's a very tranquil place, a place to reflect on the brutality of a century ago, when this entire forest was destroyed as a volunteer Welsh army faced the might of one of Germany's best fighting forces.
When the order came about 4:45, number 1 wave, over. It was synchronized along with the NCOs responsible, and over I went in the first wave.
Officers were said to attack, then they shove them back a bit further. Oh, I can't describe it. It was, you know, I don't want to describe it. We're going to travel 200-300 yards of open ground in front of a heavy machine gun fire from both flanks as well as front of him.
And yes, they paid a very heavy price. The little cemeteries dotted around the Somme, looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, are constant reminders. Among those lost at Mametz, 2 brothers from the Rhondda Valley, Henry and Thomas Hardwich, who died in each other's arms.
They suffered a terrible fate on the 7th of July. Machine guns from the wood itself and from the side, from flat iron cops, really decimated the attacking soldiers. Many of them didn't get within 200 yards of the wood itself. It was a huge trial by fire for the division.
Throughout the year, there is a constant stream of visitors to Mametz, many descendants of those who fought, little tributes left around the wood. This is the Bond family.
Well, I think we all feel very moved by what happened in the First World War. And we never knew our grandfather, but I think we're quite, you know, we were quite moved by what happened to him, and we want to be where he was killed.
Their grandfather was Major Charles Bond, who recruited thousands of young men in North Wales, many of whom lost their lives on the Somme, and their memory is still honoured by local people.
These Welshmen died for us. They died so that France could be free, so that Mametz could remain a little French village. We are 178 residents, so 3,000 lost their lives for 178 of us. So we can't forget how special this relationship is.
The First World War devastated communities throughout the United Kingdom. But for Wales, this is the spot, and this is the memorial that symbolises the extent of that loss. And the inscription is very simple. Parchwn ein hymdrechion, let us respect their efforts. Parhaid ein hatgofion, let us always remember. Mametz Wood is still the resting place of many who fell in July 1916. Their bodies were never found, but a century later, their sacrifice is not forgotten.
So, what we see there then is just a little bit of information that we're going to go through together now about the Battle of Mametz Wood. So the Battle of Mametz Wood, which is where the poem we're going to look today gets its title from, was a sub-battle or going on at the same time or within the wider Battle of the Somme. Now, as you should know from the documentary that you watched, just before half term about sort of the war poets in the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was one of the worst battles of World War I, and the sheer loss of life, even in the first day, was horrific. So the Battle of Mametz Wood was involved a area of about a mile square of woodland in France, as we've just seen, which was occupied by the Germans and their allies. And this small group of Welsh soldiers, Welsh infantry, were tasked with reclaiming and taking back this area of woodland. They were massively outnumbered, and obviously the Germans had the advantage because they could hide in the trees and use the trees for cover. And these men had to essentially walk towards these machine guns to try and, you know, eventually battle and kill the soldiers and reclaim the woodland. They were successful in the end, but the vast majority of them died doing it. And we saw in that news clip the sort of memorials and the tributes that were paid to them. So Owen Sheers wrote Mametz Wood because he saw a photograph of a mass grave. And as we'll talk about a little bit as we're annotating the poem, a mass grave. Mass graves were often used in war because they simply could not bury all of the bodies individually. There was not the time or the space. So if you were lucky enough to have your body recovered, then it was often buried, you know, in a big pit with lots of other men as well. And of course, many bodies didn't get a burial because it wasn't safe to retrieve the bodies from no man's land or from where they had fell or where they'd fallen. What made this particular grave that Owen Sheers saw the photo of memorable for him is that someone had taken the time to link the arms of all of the bodies in the graves together. So when that grave was uncovered and found, there was this image of these skeletons who had all been, who was essentially the flesh had rotted as they would after all this time, and all of these skeletons were linked, looking like something out of, you know, a medieval painting, for example. So we see that he was inspired by that image and by the story of Mametz Wood to write the poem Mametz Wood as a tribute and a remembrance to those soldiers, but also giving some wider messages about war. And that's what we're going to be annotating now. Remember, as usual, if you don't have your anthology, if you're unable to print out the copy of the poem attached to the email, it doesn't matter. You can make your own notes on a separate piece of paper, and then when we're back at school and when we'll be going over this poem again, you can write those notes out in your anthology. Okay, so here is the poem itself. Remember, as always, it's important to look at the title. So we know that Mametz Wood, its title comes from the historical battle during the Somme. So it's based, as we've learned in the video clip and we've learned about the context, this poem is referencing the Battle of Mametz Wood, which took place during the Battle of the Somme, where the group of Welsh soldiers were massively outgunned. They were, you know, they had a much smaller force, but they had to heroically and bravely try and take the area of Wood, Mametz Wood, from the enemy, who were all hiding in the woods, and they obviously had the cover of the trees, whereas the Welsh soldiers had to simply march on it and were massively outnumbered and outgunned. However, they were successful, but we know that the vast majority of them died during that battle. So the title refers to that. So for years afterwards, the farmers found them. So this idea of years afterwards. So we know it's been a long time since the battle. Okay, years and years afterwards. Now this is linking into some of the themes that we're thinking about here. The theme of time, the passing of time, and this idea of reflection. This is a very reflective poem. Dulce et decorum est is very the immediacy of battle. The soldier is very patriotic and very idealistic, looking forward. You know, it's looking forward to a future time where they might die. This poem is looking back, okay, far back, in fact, into the past. So it's very reflective. That's why it has a very, you know, this is linking in, think about our word, to the sort of somber tone and mood, you know, like the sort of mood you would have at a funeral, very somber. So the farmers found them. We've got the alliteration here. And again, there's almost a sort of innocence here, you know, think of everything farmers represent. It's very pastoral. Pastoral is just a fancy word for country. You know, it's sort of the opposite imagery to war. You know, this idea of a farmer tending his land, nurturing his land is very different to this idea of a battle. But of course we know that the vast majority of these battles took place in these huge areas of country, which after the war eventually had to be repaired and taken back into the hands of the farmers, who almost had to nurture and repair and heal the land as a result of the scars that war brought upon nature, essentially. So for years afterwards, the farmers found them. Notice we have the caesura here. Remember, caesura is when we have punctuation used at the end or at the middle of a line to slow it down. So it slows pace and makes it more reflective, and focuses here the wasted young. And notice we have the comma there. So we've got the punctuation either side of this statement. Now I'm just going to do a little arrow and come up here because this is really important, the wasted young. So wasted has two meanings here. You've got wasted as in, you know, they're essentially they're rotten bodies in the earth, as in, you know, wasting away. But what you've also got is the idea of waste of life, and that comes again from this idea of young. You know, it's this idea of, you know, they threw their young lives away. A whole generation of the youth wasted, gone, you know, wiped out. So what the farmers are finding are the wasted young, the bodies, the long buried bodies of these soldiers, turning up under their plough blades. So as they plough the earth, they are discovering the bodies of the soldiers. Now the thing to remember is that if you died in battle, if you were lucky, you got buried in a mass grave, but many, it was too unsafe to recover the bodies, so the bodies would have just laid out in no man's land. Eventually, over the time, you know, enough time would have passed that your body may sort of sink into the earth or just be buried, but a lot of them weren't buried very well. So what we are seeing is that all of these either unmarked graves or areas where these bodies had sort of inadvertently been buried are beginning to turn up as these farmers are tending the land back into itself, you know, as they're repairing the land. I'm going to put here nature. So as I said before, it's up to the farmers to heal the damage that war has had on nature. And we know that in the exam you are going to have to link these poems based on themes. So it's really important to think about how things like here, time, reflection, nature are referenced. So here's our first verse then, and our first verse or stanza is giving us this idea that actually this poem is about these soldiers being unearthed, and we know that Owen Sheers was inspired to write this based on the unearthing of a mass grave, based on, you know, linked to the Battle of Mametz Wood. So that this first stanza is showing this unearthing of these bodies by the farmers, and that's what's prompting him to write the poem. A chit of bone. Now a chit is a little piece. The china plate of a shoulder blade. So we have a metaphor here. So think about a china plate. We've got this idea of delicate, fragile bone. The relic of a finger. Now a relic is like an old and precious object. So archaeologists would dig relics up from the ground. And then we have the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull. Another metaphor. Now this is a very gruesome image of a human skull like a bird's egg. So think about it, when you smash an egg, you have all the yolk and all the sort of disgusting bits of the egg coming out. If a soldier was shot in the head, you'd have the brain essentially exploding out like the yolk of an egg. So using that metaphor of saying the skull is an egg, essentially, because remember, a metaphor tells us something is something else. That's why china plate of a shoulder blade. That shoulder blade is a china plate. That skull is an egg. It's giving us some very specific imagery here. And the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull is probably one of my favourite bits of this poem, because I think that's such an effectively subtle, you know, it's a very subtly gruesome image, because you have to actually really deconstruct how a skull can be like a bird's egg to get that idea. So what we have in this whole stanza then is it's showing us the state of the bodies. In the ground. Now, some of the fact that there'll just be these little tiny chits of bone or fingers, you know, just splayed in the earth, shoulder blades, smashed skulls, could be the fact that they just weren't buried properly, but it also could show the horrific way the soldiers died. You know, if you died by being blown apart by a shell, then the bits of your body are going to be scattered among the battlefield. So therefore, when your body eventually rots and the skeleton is all that is left, which is what we see here, we know that this is long enough that's passed. You know, it's not corpses that are being unearthed, it's bone. So we know that a long time has passed since the war. So those bodies have decomposed to the extent that it is just the skeletons left. But the fact that the way they're scattered around the field is showing us again very subtly the horrific way these soldiers probably died. The blown and broken bird's egg of a skull, all mimicked now in flint. Now if something is mimicked, it's copied, and flint is you know, a type of stone or rock. So when you first look at these bits of bone, you would think, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, these are bone. You'd think, or maybe these are, you know, just the normal sorts of rock that we would see in the ground. Breaking blue in white across this field where they were told to walk, not run, towards the wood and its nesting machine guns. Now there's quite a few things in here that we need to focus on. So first we're going to do this, told to walk, not run. So this shows the disregard the generals had for the soldiers' lives, because they are walking into an area of woodland where they know the enemy are hidden in the trees, yet they are told to walk, not run, because if they run, they have less chance of shooting one of the enemies. But of course, if they run, their enemy's got a less chance of shooting them, and they're marginally safer. So the fact that they're told to walk, not run, symbolises this commonly held notion about, you know, particularly the poets of World War I, that actually they were seen as, you know, the generals didn't care about their lives. They were just numbers, you know, on a battle plan to them, and they were prepared to throw these soldiers' lives away as long as they got victory. So Owen Sheers is referencing that sort of sentiment or feeling here, with the idea that actually if you're walking to battle rather than running, your life is in much more danger. And all the generals cared about was success, not the lives of these men. Then we have, so the wood, you know, it's Mametz Wood here, so it's again referencing back to this battle, and it's nesting machine guns. Now, nesting is really interesting here, because what we have is firstly a reference to the enemy hidden in the trees. But another way of viewing it is that actually, you know, this whole thing is an affront to nature. Birds should be nesting in the trees. Not guns. You know, we think of nesting and it's, you know, something pregnant women do when they sort of feel like they need to get their house ready for their baby. Nesting is obviously what animals do when they are bringing up their young. So nesting machine guns is a real juxtaposition here of positive and negative imagery. So what Owen Sheers is doing there is two things. He's firstly showing us that these machine guns are hidden in the trees, much like a nest is hidden in the trees, which is going to make it more dangerous for these soldiers who are walking towards this woodland. But he's also showing us, again, linking back to this idea of nature, as we did earlier, that actually war is disrupting nature. You know, the woods should be a peaceful place where the animals are free to go on, you know, living their lives. It should be the birds that are nesting in the trees, not the machine guns. That's what I mean there by an affront to nature. And even now, so we're back to the present, okay? Because what we do here is we go briefly into the past. And even now, the earth stands sentinel. Now, a sentinel is a guard. So what we have here is the personification of the earth, again, nature, guarding the bodies of the soldiers. So I always think this is really quite an emotional image, actually, this idea of the earth guarding and protecting those bodies in the ground, reaching back into itself for reminders of what happened. So this idea of reaching back into itself is again looking at time, reaching back to the past. So we see here, when we talked about earlier, this idea of time in this poem. So it's reaching back into the past of reminders of what had happened. So it's reminders of the men's death. You know, just think about how many have forgotten. And I'd never heard of the Battle of Mametz Wood before I read this poem, and had to obviously do my own research on it before I had to teach it for the first time. I'd never heard of the Battle of Mametz Wood. I knew the Battle of the Somme, and anyone that's ever studied World War I would know, because it's one of the most horrendous battles ever, really. But I'd never heard of the Battle of Mametz Wood. So this idea of reaching back into this reminder of what had happened is essentially linking into Owen Sheers' whole purpose of writing this poem. He wants to remind the reader of the sacrifice and the wasted young that threw their lives away, or were forced to throw their lives away in war. But he also wants to memorialise and remember these specific men in the Battle of Mametz Wood. So reaching back into itself for reminders of what happened, like, so we've got our simile, a wound working a foreign body to the surface of the skin. Now this is another very sort of complex image here, really. So it's a simile, we can tell by our like here. Now, like a wound. So we can interpret wound in several ways. It's almost like a wound or a scar on our country or the world, you know, due to the horror of war. Any war that happens for any reason should feel like a wound, and then when that wound heals, a scar on our conscience as human beings. Because war, no matter how justified people might feel at the time, war is essentially, again, an affront to nature. War destroys and kills, and people may think that it's for the greater good, but that greater good isn't often a lot of justification for the families of those men who have died, or you know, nowadays men and women that have died. So he's making a wider point about war, that yes, sometimes war may have to happen and is necessary, but it should always be viewed as a wound, you know, on our conscience, essentially, as human beings, that we are so horrendous as a species that we feel the need to commit mass murder on each other over land, or because of power, or because of offence, or because of religion. So he's making a wider point here about war. And what essentially he's saying here with this simile is that as these bones of these soldiers are working their way up out of the earth and onto the surface, it's reminding us of what happened. So it's linking here again to this idea of the reminder of these men's deaths. But we should look at this reminder, we should look at these skeletons and remember with a sense of not necessarily your typical tribute to the sacrifice and almost revering these men. And yes, of course, we should always honour and pay tribute to anyone that sacrifices their life for their country, and that, you know, they are worthy of our respect and our tribute. But Owen Sheers is also looking at it a different way here. He's saying that yes, we should feel all those feelings for these individual men that have died and been forced to give up their lives, but as human beings, we should find war abhorrent, we should find war a despicable stain on the conscience of mankind. So we should be reminded of both of those things, and they contrast one another. You know, this idea of paying tribute and being proud of the men who have died, and at the same time being horrified that they needed to die in the first place. That sort of contrasting feeling that Owen Sheers is trying to evoke with this word, which obviously, or this phrase, which we don't have space to write all of that down, but hopefully that makes sense. So this morning, so again, this idea of time. So we've got into, you know, the immediate the immediate present here. 20 men buried in one long grave. So they found a mass grave, and remember, as I mentioned earlier, there was not the sheer number of men that died meant that if you were lucky enough to get a burial, there was no way you could each be buried individually. So they would dig a big hole and they would put all of the bodies in there. So that's what's been unearthed and discovered by these farmers. A broken mosaic of bone linked arm in arm. So we're going to look at the two halves of this line. So a broken mosaic of bone is another metaphor. It's showing us the state of the bodies. Now, a mosaic is a picture or a pattern made up of lots of different pieces of something, often you know, broken up glass or china, for example, would then be put together in grout or some sort of plaster, and it would make a picture. So this mosaic of bone, broken mosaic of bone, is again referring to all of the pieces of the bone scattered, but they're linked arm in arm. And remember, this is a reference to the photo that inspired Sheers to write the poem. Someone had taken the time to link the men arm in arm. Think about when you were little and you'd walk around linked in arm with your best friend. Maybe that's more of a girl thing than a boy thing, to at the risk of sounding sexist. Or think of when, you know, people are performing the can-can and they're all linked in arm, kicking their legs. That image is one that, again, Sheers is trying to put into our head here. Someone has taken the time to link all of their skeletons in the ground. So rather than just sort of fling these bodies in there, bury them and move on, someone has taken the time to almost unify and link them together in death. And there's something very touching and very emotional about someone taking the time to literally manipulate and move these dead bodies so all of their arms are linked. So it's this idea of them being together even in death, which is very emotional. Their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre. Now, dance macabre is French for the dance of death. So, again, when I mentioned the can-can, it's this almost very macabre, very dark image of these men almost looking like their skeletons could get up and do a dance, but it is a very grim, very, very dark dance, not something to be celebrated. And again, paused has wider significance here, because it's this idea, you know, their lives are permanently paused. You know, they're dead. They never got to. They were paused in that moment of death, and you know, no one was ever able to hit play. No one was ever able to restart those lives again. So we have this idea of the tragedy of their death. So their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre in boots that outlasted them. And again, what we have here is the enjambment. Now we're going to talk more about the effect of the enjambment and caesura when we are studying these back in class, because they're, you know, talking about poems structurally is always trickier than analysing the language. But what we have here, remember, enjambment is when there is no punctuation at the end of a line and it flows on to the next. And what we have here is the enjambment between stanzas. So their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre in boots that outlasted them. So what Sheers is trying to do is connect those images. So these skeletons are still wearing their boots. Their boots have not rotted away. Their boots have outlasted them. So, you know, again, we've got the tragedy that the men died before their time. and it makes this image of these skeletons paused mid-dance macabre even more powerful and tragic, in the idea that now you're picturing these skeletons with boots on, which is again even more bizarre and horrifying. Their socketed heads tilted back at an angle, and their jaws, those that have them, dropped open. So this is a really specific image here. We are now having to imagine the skulls of these bodies. So their socketed heads, you know, again, it's a very subtly gruesome image here. It's reminding us, you know, their flesh, in this case eyes, have rotted away. But there's also something quite inherently creepy about socketless, you know, eye sockets in a skull. It's often very dark because of the shadows of the inside of the skull. So it's actually quite, you know, a frightening image there as well. So their socketed heads tilted back at an angle as if they're pointing upwards. And their jaws, those that have them, dropped over. Now again, those that have them is really clever, because it's subtly it's again it's subtly showing the state the bodies are in again. Now this idea of it being dropped open, it's almost like maybe like they are screaming, or maybe like they want to speak. It's like they've got something to say, these men. You know, their mouths or their jaws are open, and he links that image into this final stanza, as if the notes that they had sung have only now, with this unearthing, slipped from their absent tongues. So the notes that they have sung here is a reference to their story or their death, and it is, you know, only now the bodies have been uncovered that their story will be told, and they will be remembered. So we've got, again, linking back to, you know, the start of the poem, we talked about this idea of time, remembrance, nature being, you know, a theme of this poem, as is obviously war and loss of life. But we've got, it ends with this idea that now that the bodies have been unearthed, that these men, even though they have no physical tongues to tell their story, their bones and their bodies and the story of what happened to them will now be told. And he chooses to be one of the people to tell that story through this poem. And like I said, I didn't know about the Battle of Mametz Wood until I read this poem. So we can see Owen Sheers being successful in his intentions. So now we've annotated the poem, I'd just like you to do this next task. So I'd like you to think about, how does Owen Sheers present war in Mametz Wood? Now you've got two choices here. You could either just write a summary, summarise what you've learned through your annotation on how Owen Sheers presents war in Mametz Wood, or if you would prefer, you could pick any quotation from the poem and write a single mini PE paragraph, just exploring how the language of that quote expresses ideas about war. Okay, so you can pause the video and get that done. So finally then, pick and explode one short quote which presents a somber atmosphere. So look back at the poem, think about a quotation that presents a somber, sad, reflective atmosphere and explode it. And then personification. So how does the personification used in Mametz Wood compare to the personification in the soldier? So think about the earth, you know, standing sentinel and guarding these bodies. How does that compare to the use of personification of, you know, England being like their mother in the soldier? Okay, well done.